I'm with Emma, and we're going to talk today about sexuality. And Emma, would you give a little bit of background about who you are and why sexuality is a subject you deal with?
Yes, so I am a current student at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and my interest in religion and my interest in sexuality is very bound up together. And that's because both of those passions stemmed from my experience in college. So I did not personally identify as a person of faith before college, and through a series of circumstances ended up at a church that I found a community in that I loved and felt loved me, a church that was even LGBT affirming. And as an LGBT person, that meant a lot to me. And at the same time, outside of the church, I was having relationships with people for the first time and experiencing sexuality for myself for the first time. And while a lot of that was incredibly positive, there was a circumstance in college in which a former partner of mine decided to share private photos and videos of myself to other people without my consent. And I was devastated by that experience and came to realize that this community that I loved so much and loved me so much didn't necessarily feel like a safe place to talk about that because there was no conversation about sex. And that spurred for me a whole bunch of work around how can we have these conversations in churches? Why are these conversations important? Why do these conversations need to happen both in conservative and progressive churches? Because my experience is in a progressive church. And what can we do to have more of a holistic understanding of what sexuality means and what sex means?
Yeah. And your story kind of reminds me a bit of even within families, there's not a lot of conversation around sex. There seems to be, in my generation, my mother went out and bought me a book about hamsters. It was called Susie's Babies. And there was this cage where there was a little boy and a little girl hamster. And some few pages later, there was Susie and her babies all lined up, and the little boy was gone. And I thought, okay, I don't know what happened, but somehow Susie started having babies, which of course wrapped up into the theology or fundamentalist beliefs that sex is all about a boy and a girl getting together and having babies, which is another piece that I think a lot of people struggle with.
Absolutely. And as someone who does a lot of sex education work, one thing that I've come to realize both in and outside of churches is there is both a whole lot of silence around sex, a lack of, or an amount of discomfort around talking about sex, around having sex education classes, a fear that might somehow lead to people being very sexual or people practicing sexual activities that might diverge from heterosexuality and heterosexual activities. And at the same time, there's also this expectation that once you're married or that once you're in a stable relationship, you should know all about sex and you should know all the things that you're supposed to do to protect yourself and all the things you're supposed to do to care for your partner and all the things you're supposed to do to have these sophisticated and complicated conversations. So there's this big gap, right? And one of my passions is trying to fill that gap by saying, what are we missing right now? What are some of the harmful things that we're teaching people? And how can we make this content more accessible, not only to folks who are straight, but for folks who are LGBTQ plus as well?
Yeah. How have you found patriarchy to fit into this whole area? Because in growing up, I saw male figureheads in our church. The men were supposed to be the one to speak, and they ran the home. Now, of course, women had their ways of getting around that, but when it comes to sexuality, what does patriarchy do regarding sexuality?
Well, one thing that is fundamental to patriarchy is the regulation of people's bodies, right? And specifically the regulation of bodies that society deems as female. And that affects women, that affects a lot of trans folks, that affects a lot of queer folks. And in sex education and in the way we talk about sex, that often manifests as a lot of bias. So men or folks that society labels as men are often expected to be very sexually free, to have a lot of sexual experience, to be very sexually domineering, to be able to implicitly know what their partner wants. Women or folks that are deemed women are often taught that they have to be pure, that they have to save themselves for marriage with their husband, or they will not be worthy, that their worth is tied to their virginity, which is a very old concept that was around when women were their virginity was a dowry, and it was a commodity, like an economic commodity. So that is rooted in a lot of historical truths. And these women are taught that their pleasure is not important, that their primary job when having sex with their husband is to please their husband. So there is this lack of centering on their own experience, and a lot of shame, and a lot of silence, and a lot of regulation.
I have been in the presence of men who have actually had something on a wall that would say something to the effect, "Don't touch my car or my daughter." And I would think, I know you mean that in an affectionate way, but the harm that does, how do you see the role of fathers in a daughter's life? And I'm using this loosely because I understand that it's not just men and who have daughters, and it's not just men and women who are parents.
Yeah, so one of my interests in particular has to do with evangelical purity culture. And the common practice in evangelical purity culture are purity balls, in which a young pre-adolescent or adolescent girl will take their father as a date to the ball, and they will pledge their virginity to their father until that virginity is eventually given to their husbands.
Boy, no problem there.
So there is this legacy of women having or women feeling that their virginity is beholden to their father. And a lot of, I think, expectation there and shame there. And also another important thing to note is, for folks who are survivors of incest violence or sexual violence in the home, that model also can be incredibly damaging, incredibly traumatic, and reinforce a lot of that relinquishment of sexual agency and power to a authority figure in the home that's abusing that.
Have you seen models of churches that are dealing with sexuality in a healthy way?
Yes. So there is actually one of the most comprehensive sex education curriculums in the country is a religiously rooted curriculum called Our Whole Lives, or OWL. And that is done by the Unitarian Universalist Church and the United Church of Christ. And I think a lot of those efforts have been really effective in breaking down sexuality in a really holistic way, right? So both talking about sexual identity, i.e. who you are sexually attracted to, if anybody, talking about sexual practice, so how you are having sex, if you are having sex, how you're practicing safe sex, sexual behavior, so how you are talking about consent, when you have sex, during, before, during, after, and also talking about or breaking down sexual expectations, so talking about how society's expectations of sexual behaviors are informed by gender, they're informed by race, they're informed by class, they're informed by religious identity. So I think some of the best conversations around sexuality are actually happening in these church congregations, which is really exciting.
Yeah, and it's a huge relief to see that it's moving in that direction, because things don't get better when we ignore them. I mean, that's just, if we don't know that by now, all we have to do is look at the state of the world as it is. What about sex workers? You talked earlier about how women having ownership of their own bodies, and there is this concept of human trafficking, and I find it's difficult for people to parse out. There are people who choose to be sex workers, and there are people who are trafficked, and the differences.
Yes. So a great passion of mine, I'm very grateful you are mentioning this, is talking about sex worker justice, especially in religious settings. So as you named, I think a lot of religious settings conflate sex work with sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is a horrible act of violence in which an individual is forced to perform sexual acts without their consent, and are not compensated in any way for those sexual acts. Sex work is a big umbrella. It can include folks who consensually sleep with other people for money. It can include people who are cam girls or cam boys who essentially either perform sexual acts or present their bodies in sexual ways on camera for money for people who are online. And then there are porn performers who are sex workers. There are folks who are sex surrogates that help other people who want to explore sexuality, but for different reasons have obstacles that have prevented them from doing so. So I think it's super, super important in religious spaces not to conflate sexual violence with consensual sex work. And also making more spaces to affirm and welcome those sex workers who often feel very alienated from the church and who feel that they cannot be their full selves and be open and transparent about their work in church settings because there is such a strong opposition.
Well, it gets turned into a moral issue, and I think primarily if it's a woman I mean, we're still bound up in a culture where people who present as males are claimed to be, what is the word, cisgender, get a pass on their activities, whereas women are judged on them.
Absolutely, and I think when it comes to things like sex work, those standards and that regulation can harm people in very tangible ways. So another thing that is really exciting is there is a new movement happening called Decrim Now that is based in New York City, and it is a group of sex workers, primarily sex workers of color, who are arguing for or advocating for the decriminalization of sex work on the basis of the abuse that they have experienced at the hands of the police, who are not only prosecuting and incarcerating sex workers, but also in many cases committing sexual violence against sex workers. So it is also important to recognize that these issues are bound up again in racial justice. They're bound up in questions of labor and class, and they are incredibly dependent on a holistic understanding of people's identities.
And so living in a capitalist, white supremacist culture really enhances the possibility that there's going to be sexual violence, and not just against women, but primarily against women. And people who are if someone is a member of the LGBTQ community, that just seems to have an extra, the inability of people to allow people to simply be who they are makes them a target. So, well, I hope at some point we can break this down more and go into some areas that I think a lot of us who are in the world of, where we talk a lot about gender and sexuality, tend to forget that there's a whole world out there that has no concept what we're talking about. And yet those very people, many of them are trying to make sense of what's happening in their own lives. And the best thing that could happen is having open, honest conversations.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.